Hi guys, thanks for being here. We know this is the last talk. You guys must be a big fan for Active Directory. So our topic today is the overlooked tactics for attacking Active Directory. First, we will do introduction. So my name is Hao Wang. I'm the manager for the EY cybersecurity practice and primarily focus on attack and penetration testing. We have present in SANS, ISACA, Troopers before.
Hi, my name is Yothin, Rodanant. I'm a manager of the EY cybersecurity practice, primarily focused on attack and pen, has been presented at the RSA and Troopers.
And I'm Josh, pretty much the same thing, also focused on attack and pen and EY. Just a quick disclaimer, none of the ideas or content, opinions, anything in here is shared, supported, or endorsed by our employers. And then just to level set what we're talking about today, this isn't focused on a specific CVE. The exploitation that we're talking about within this presentation is really focused on a lot of the overlooked methods that we've identified as we've gone through the process of attacking red forests. Up front, we want to thank a number of individuals. They're probably not here, but just a call out. A lot of their tools and their research is actually what's laid the groundwork for really laid the groundwork and enabled us to kind of focus on utilizing key aspects of their research in order to do our jobs, really. So the agenda is, we're going to pretty much give a high-level overview of what a hardened Active Directory environment really is, then a couple of use cases where we've been able to successfully compromise an environment like that, and then ultimately some enhancement on the back end. So just an overview. I think the term red forest gets thrown out a lot, but that's really what we're talking about here. It's formally referred to as the Enhanced Security Administrative Environment. This concept is really multi-tiered. The first is to try to provide a hardened administrative environment that is standalone. And then the second is to try to tier and segregate Active Directory objects to try to contain an attacker within a specific zone. So the primary concept, it's a three-tier model. The first is in tier 0, we're talking about those that have administrative access over the forest, domain administrators, domain controllers, anything that would allow for forest or domain-wide compromise. The tier 1 is usually server admins, and this applications, cloud admins. And then tier 2 is focused on workstation administrators. All of this is privilege segregation. This is focused on the administrators of these different environments and not necessarily on the specific users within it. So high level overview, pretty much, if you're in a certain tier, you would have the ability to interactively administer that specific tier. But there are a series of controls that prevent you from moving down a tier or moving up a tier. The idea behind this is to try to contain an attacker. So if an environment is compromised and it's on a workstation level, there isn't a privilege escalation up to a server tier. Or if it's done on the server level, there isn't privilege escalation up to that of a domain administrator. We've talked about segregating, tiering those objects. The other element to this is really creating an administrative forest that's isolated from the production forest. A lot of this is usually done with, in addition to the forest being created, is usually done also with network access control. So there's limitations in place even between the production tiers and then ultimately with the administrative forest. And the thought is that no production Active Directory admin or group would have access to this red forest. And so all all administrative accounts are really managed through some sort of password management solution. And then a lot of times we see multi-factor in place. And so that's really, those are the primary tenets of this model. So if you're a pen tester and they've architected this to limit communication between these different tiers or these different zones, and usually you're able to get, let's say, workstation admin, or you're able to get a server admin. How do you ultimately compromise the domain? How do you get that level of access that ultimately allows you to move wherever you need to go within the environment? And a lot of times this becomes an issue, especially if you're targeting a segregated environment once you've gone through production, and let's say you're focused on an OT environment or a SCADA environment. How do you go through the process of actually targeting that specific environment? A lot of times you need certain credentials within the environment, and domain level compromise allows you to gather some of that and use that context to move where you need to go. So for the sake of this presentation, we'll be primarily focused on that tier 0 within the production network. How do you get to that level of domain admin compromise?
Yeah, so next topic, we will basically talk about something called the shadow admin account. So like first, you will ask, like, what is shadow admin account? Right, so here we are meaning shadow admin are the account that in your network, but that are always overlooked by enterprise, just because those accounts don't belong to any powerful Active Directory group. Okay, so we will highlight a few things here. The first one is the account who are not domain admin, enterprise admin, but they have something called the DC sync right, or some account have full control to either root domain object or admin SD holder. So first, DC sync, right? So for those of you who don't know about what DC sync is, so basically DC sync essentially allow you to impersonate your own computer as a domain controller to replicate credentials from other legitimate domain controllers. Okay, so to perform a DC sync attack within Active Directory, basically you need 2 permissions. The first one is replication directory change. The second one is replication directory change all. Okay, and so just based on our experience, we have seen a lot of misconfigured applications, or some applications require DC sync permission. We will just highlight a few applications. There may be a lot. We don't want to use time here to go through everything. We will just talk about SharePoint and the Azure AD Sync service. Okay, so for Microsoft SharePoint, so if you want to use SharePoint in Active Directory, so basically you need to set up something called user profile service account. So what this account do is going to synchronize all the user profile change information between Active Directory and the SharePoint environment. So it just makes sure everything is synchronized. So just per Microsoft requirement, you just need a replication directory change permission in order for this service account to be fully functional. But what we have seen in the past, people always gave them all the full permission to this account, including those directory change and the directory change all permission. So it just creates an instance, right? So once the attacker compromises the SharePoint server, they got this service account, and then they can use that account to do DC sync, retrieve all the password hash from domain controllers. Okay, so this is another example, right? We understand a lot of enterprise, they try to migrate their local AD to Azure Cloud, right? So to do that, typically you need to set up a Azure AD sync service. And so in order to make sure that the service is functional, you need to have a service account, right? And by default, Microsoft require you give the DC sync permission to that account. So just in case, right, you compromise that Azure AD sync server in your premise domain, then you can own the entire AD. So we understand those things has been covered by a lot of people in the past. So we just want to highlight something here because I think after this session, we will talk about the exchange, which require a lot of knowledge we are talking about here. So for the full control of root domain object, so we just talk about the DC thing, right? So if you find some account which has full control to the root domain object, like domain.com, right? So then you can potentially also have the DC sync right to retrieve all the credentials from domain controller, just because the full control also includes the DC sync permission. Okay. The last thing we want to cover in this topic is the admin SD holder. So as you guys know, right? So people has been talking about admin SD holder for the past few years, and primarily they use that as a persistence mechanism to maintain access in Active Directory environment. But what we want to highlight here, you can actually use the admin SD holder object to escalate privilege to compromise the entire domain. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know what admin SD holder is, basically it is an object located in the system partition of Active Directory. And the cool part is the ACL of the admin SD holder object is used as a template to replicate all the permissions to all the protected domain group. When we talk about group, it includes domain admin group, include the enterprise admin group. So it means if you find some account that has full control to admin SD holder object, you can potentially add any other account to the domain admin group or enterprise admin group. So for admin SD holder, I think we can primarily look for 3 permissions. The first one is the full control. Second one is write permission. The third one is modify permission. So if you have full control or write permission, basically you can add whatever user account you want into whatever group you want. Okay. If you have the modify permission, it's a little bit different. So basically you need to give one account full control for admin SD holder, and then you use that account to give other account access to the sensitive group like domain admin. We will cover all the details later, so we have a diagram to lay out. I know it's probably a little bit confusing here. So next topic, we will talk about exchange. Okay. So first question, how many of you are using exchange in your enterprise environment, including 65, Office 365? Okay, so then you probably have issues here. Okay. So the first thing we want to cover is like a lot of people are doing research about Exchange, especially for the past 2 years. And Microsoft even released some notification, right? They are saying there are some privilege escalation or vulnerability or issues within Exchange, and people can leverage that to compromise the entire forest. But like it's really hard to find all the technical details online or from the website. So in this talk, we will highlight step by step about what you need to do in order to escalate privilege from a regular domain user account to domain admin. Okay. So as you know, Exchange uses a permission model called role-based access control since 2010. Okay, so what role-based access control does, it actually more like a least privilege model to manage all the permissions within AD. And so within role-based access control, so roles are defined more for like job responsibilities instead of you have to create a specific ACL for a specific user, such as Exchange 2007. And so from Exchange 2010, there are 2 new groups. The first one called Exchange Windows Permission. The second one called Exchange Trusted Subsystem. So we can call the first one EWP, and then the second one is ETS. So just as you can see from the diagram here. And so basically the parent group is EWP, Exchange Windows Permission. And under that, there is a child group called Exchange Trusted Subsystem. And under that, the system account of Exchange servers are actually members of those groups. Okay, and so in addition to that, so EWP also has a lot of direct interaction with Active Directory object, something like a write permission to some sensitive object within AD. And the Exchange Trust subsystem, basically it manages all the object inside of Exchange. Okay, so and this is another screenshot. So once you run net group for those 2 group name, within your AD environment, you will find out Microsoft tell you those two groups have a lot of rights. Basically, it can modify or change any exchange or Active Directory object. So we did some research on this. So basically, we set up our testing environment. We stand up Exchange 2010, 2013, 2016. Okay, and as a result, so we found the issue here. So the Exchange Windows Permission Group, EWP, always granted with modified permission for the root domain object of your domain, in case your domain is domain.com, okay, as well as the child object. So what does that mean? Okay, so let's say if the EWP has modified permission to the root domain object, it means their children, like the members of that group, in this case, the system account of Exchange servers, they will automatically have those permission. Okay, so if like some account have modified permission to the domain root object, like we mentioned before, what you can do, you can do a DC sync attack, right? So it means you can use those Exchange system account, grant whatever user account you want with the DC sync permission, and then you can retrieve some credentials from domain controller. So this is the attack path, right? It's pretty straightforward. So first step, you compromise the Exchange server, and you get the system access on Exchange, and then you use that access to grant domain user account with certain permission you want. In this case, we just use DC sync, and then you can retrieve password hash. So there are like a few attack methods. The first one we want to highlight here is power view. Okay, so to do this attack, we have to be under the assumption we got the Exchange server access already as a local admin or domain admin as running as a local admin on that box. Okay, and so what you can do if you get the machine account hash of Exchange server, you can just pass the hash, right? Or you can use Windows credential editor or Mimikatz. You can do that. Then you can load the Power View module, okay, which will be running on the user context of the NT system account, okay. And then you can leverage that right to assign DC sync permission to the domain user account and perform the DC sync attack. So we will have a demo here to show you how you actually can do this. So first, we log into the domain controller. We try to create one account called Red Team. Okay, it's just like a regular domain user account. It doesn't have any special permission to the root domain object. And yeah, so whatever we are doing here, we just want to show this account doesn't have any rights, any privilege. Okay, then we log into another server, which is the Exchange server as a local admin, the account name called the Exchange. So it's just like a local admin account. It's not a domain account. It only has the local admin rights on that Exchange server. And now we are going to use PSExec to kick off a PowerShell process. And because the reason we are using PSExec here, we just want to run in the context of NT system on that Exchange server, okay? So that you can use that right to grant permission to domain user account. And then we load the Power View. So there's a module within Power View called add domain object ACL. So you can use that module to grant DC sync permission to domain user account. In this case, we try to grant the permission to the Red Team account we just created. Okay. So we go back to our domain controller. Basically, we are going to check if we successfully added any new permission for that Red Team account. So we found that the red team account, and as you can see, it has all the replication directory change and the directory change all permission. Okay, so it means it can do DC sync, right? So just for a proof of concept, right, from our attacking box, we try to do a DC sync with secret dump with that red team account. And as you can see, we are trying to dump credential from one of the domain controller. Okay, so. Okay, so there's like another attack method, right? We just mentioned power view. There's also like a way you can use the native Exchange PowerShell to accomplish the same work, okay? So what you need to do, right? So you can either RDP to the Exchange server, and or you can use BSidesLV remotely access to the computer to the Exchange server. The point is to get an NT-system shell on that Exchange box, right? And then what you can do, you can use the built-in PowerShell. Basically, it's an Exchange management shell to add user permissions. Okay, so this way is very stealth, right? Because whatever you are doing here, the BSidesLV is now stealth. Okay, you can use some other stuff like schedule task, right? You can be creative. But for the PowerShell script you are using here, it's the native PowerShell within the Exchange server. Okay, so it's really hard for the SOC team to detect that. And then you can still give the permission to an AD account, and then you can accomplish your attack path, right? So after you finish, you can use like another module within this PowerShell to remove the permission you just added to that user account, right? Just to clear your trace. And so for Exchange 2010, the command is a little bit different because the Exchange like snap-in module, you need to change the name to E2010. We also list the command here. So after the talk, we will share the DAG, and you can retrieve them. So we just want to show another demo for this. Okay, so it's the same thing. So for now, we log into the domain controller. We try to create some new user account. Okay, in this case, we call that red team 1. And we also create another one called red team 2. So we created 2 accounts, and they are brand new, and they only belong to the domain user group. There are no special permission assigned for this account to the root AD object. This better. Yeah, so we just want to highlight here, there are no permissions for those accounts yet. And then again, we log into our Exchange server as the local admin account Exchange. Again, this account is just a local admin account. It's not a domain account. So it only has local admin access on that specific Exchange server. And then we use BSidesLV again to obtain the NT system authority access. And then we try to use the built-in PowerShell module from Exchange to grant permission to the red team 1 with DC sync. So just to simplify the process, we put the PowerShell command into one line. So it's just convenient. The first line is to add one permission. The second line is to add the other permission required for DC sync. And then we go back to the domain controller again. We just want to check if we have successfully added those permissions. So the reason you see a different interface here because we are doing this demo in Exchange 2006. the first demo we showed is in Exchange 2013. So as you can see, the two required permissions are created. So just for proof of concept, we try to retrieve the credential from the domain controller by using the red team 1 account. We just granted DC sync permission with yeah, as you can see, it works. So we just got the hash from domain controller. So before we talk to the next topic, we just want to highlight the process. So the whole thing is really easy, right? What you need to do, you need to get the local admin access or system NT access to one of the exchange server, and then you can potentially compromise the entire AD. So we found this is really interesting, right? So we tested this in the Exchange 2013, and we found it out. The Exchange Trust subsystem group actually granted with modified permission for the admin SD holder object. Okay, so we only found this in 2013, but you may find this on 2016 because there's an issue for Exchange, right? So if you upgrade from 2013 to 2016, the permission may carry. Okay, so if you have modified permission on the admin SD holder, what you can do, right? So just like I talked before, right, you can essentially use the system account of Exchange server to assign like full control on the admin SD holder object. And then you can use that domain user account with the full control to add a user into the domain admin group or enterprise admin group. So again, like you also can use the native Exchange PowerShell to do this. Okay, what you need to do, you just need to ps-exec to the Exchange machine to get the NT system shell, and then you can grant the generic all permission to the account you want. Okay, and then we can show the last demo here. So again, like we try to create two accounts from the domain controller. In this case, those two accounts are green team 1 and the green team 2. Yeah, and again, we are just trying to make sure those account doesn't have special control on the admin SD holder object. And then they only belong to the domain user group. Okay, then we log in back to our Exchange server. In this case, it's the same thing. We log in as the local admin account. Okay. And as you can see, this account only has local admin access to this box. And like we change our approach a little bit. So we try to ps-exec remotely from our attack machine to the Exchange server. So to just give you a different view about how to perform this attack. And as you can see, we use the built-in PowerShell module, just one line, to grant permission to the green team 1 account. So it should have full control to the admin SD holder object. Yeah, so as you can see, so we added the full control for the admin SD holder object. So it means if you have full control to that, then you can have full control to domain admin group. So it means you probably can add another user account into domain admin directly. So for now, we added the green team 1 account into the Exchange server because we just want to run as the green team 1 account to open like a user management toolkit. So now this Active Directory user management toolkit is run by the Green Team 1 account with the full admin SD holder permission. And then we go to the domain admin group. So click the add button. And in this case, we add the Green Team 2 account into the domain admin group. And just to validate that, so we run that group domain admin. You can see the Green Team 2 account is in the domain admin group. Okay, so there's a third group in Exchange called Organization Management. Although this group does not have direct interaction with the Active Directory object, but it can be used to add members to those two groups we mentioned before, the EWP and the ETS. So if in case you compromise one of the Organization Management account, you can add any user to those two groups just to perform the same attack we mentioned before. Okay, so just to summarize, we did all the testing from 2007, 2016 to 2016 in the Exchange environment. Okay, and most of the attack, especially for those privileged escalation attack, work in 2010, 2013, 2016. The only reason it didn't work on 2007 because during that time, Windows Exchange 2007 was not using the role-based access control, and those new group didn't exist during that time. Okay, people may ask if we are using Office 365, are we secure? The answer may be yes, maybe no, right? So, but in most of the case, even you have Office 365 running in the cloud, you have to have a local Exchange server just to maintain all the user profiles. So there's still a very, very high risk here. Okay.
All right. Our next topic here is about leveraging the virtualization platform and backup solution to attack the hardened Active Directory environment. So most organizations, I'm pretty sure most organizations implement the virtualization technology, basically leveraging the VMware or other platform to virtualize the server. So most of the server that you have here, probably one of them could be domain controllers, could be Exchange server, and then those administrator account within the virtualization platform, they might not receive the same attention as those domain admin account. So what we like to highlight is if the company forgot to treat this admin as a higher tier as well, they could potentially be used to compromise the organization. So basically, if somebody compromised and get the VM admin account, they could potentially download the VMware disk or extracting the password hash from the operating system directly. So just to show you, many organizations may not aware that they have a lot of admin account in their vCenter environment. The audit may not show up, but if you look at the console, there might be a lot of nested group within those accounts. And these accounts usually have access to multiple data center, and then a lot of the VM reside within those data center. Another trick is if you need to jump to different tier environment, usually we have firewall to segment most of the secure environment from one another. However, if the organization leverage this virtualization platform, they usually configure network in this environment. So attacker might be able to target the console to log in directly at the console level and bypass that restriction. Similarly, this is some of the way we want to show how an attacker go to extract the password hash from the VMDK disk. So basically, this assumption is the vCenter hosts one of the domain controller image in the environment. The attacker might move laterally on the network to obtain the VM admin credentials. So we come up with 3 different ways you can go and extract those images. The first way is to use just a plain GUI that used for managing the vSphere or vCenter, log in through either web interface or thick client, go browse through a data store, locate the target domain controller image, and those can typically guess from the naming convention or standard documentation within the organization. Next is to leverage the command line. So VMware also provide a lot of extensive PowerShell command line to interact with the virtualization environment. So in this case, we can use the same command line that the admin used to copy out the domain controller image out of critical servers. However, the first 2 methods I just mentioned, it may not always work. If they're running instant, it might cause some resource conflict. So from my experience, one of the reliable way to retrieve the image is to leverage some of the commercial tool or freeware to basically create a snapshot of the target VM and then do replicate those VM directly to your machine. However, this attack may, as an incident response team, if they have a traffic monitoring capability in an organization, they might be able to spot the bandwidth spike. If somebody download like 100 gig of data move between switch, this might be one of the attack that they could potentially spot on. So one attacker gain access to those VM image on they need to, if they need to access those file system, they have to merge those files. So within the VMware SDK, there are some command line that you can use to merge those files together and leverage the forensic tools such as OSF mount to mount those disks and then browse through the file system. Alternatively, you can also use the mount command in Linux to mount those file system and gain access to ntds.dit and system hive to extract the password hash within the Active Directory. Another way is we commonly found, this is not specific to a certain product, but sometimes if you know that the target organization use certain type of backup software to back up the database of a domain controller or we target those systems, basically trying to get admin credential for those systems, and then basically try to locate the disk that the admin use. And oftentimes, some of these might left on the NFS or iSCSI storage that might not be properly set the permission. So as an attacker, we could potentially leverage this method to extract the credentials that way. So as you can see from screenshot, it's very trivial. Once you know some documentation, look up the way to back up, then you leverage the same feature that admin used to steal the image.
Excuse me. All right. So if you haven't started to notice a theme in some of these paths, typically we're trying to find any sort of gray area in terms of the boundaries between these tiers, or areas where a certain tier wasn't necessarily as protected as there were certain settings in place that were overlooked. In this case, one of the things that we've utilized in the past is actually leveraging certain endpoint technologies. So if you have a tiered model and you've segregated out these different machines, how does a pen tester try to move up or how does an attacker try to target that higher level tier? And one of the ways you can do it is through endpoint products. Essentially, if the different tiers are sharing the same management console, be it an antivirus solution or SCCM, you can weaponize that in order to try to grant or gain access to a tier that you may not be able to interact with otherwise. So in this case, one of the an attack example that we've used in the past is essentially an antivirus solution or endpoint protection was being utilized on different tiers, and that tier, those different tiers were all sharing the same management console. And so the thought was, can we use this endpoint to essentially push a payload and use the environment to push a payload ultimately to try to execute something on a domain controller or gain access that we wouldn't otherwise have. And so the way we go about doing this within SEP is we create a host integrity policy. And so you'd go through the process. This assumes you've targeted the antivirus admin and you have this level of access. But you'd create a new policy, and within that policy, you would create a custom requirement for that new host integrity policy. And within there, you can add a function and load in whatever payload you want. In this case, we've typically used VB script. And so what we do is create two scripts, one to essentially add a user account, and then a second to add it to the domain administrators group. And then we would assign that to something on a different tier. So from the management console, you would assign this policy to a tier that you wouldn't have access to, and ultimately have it execute on behalf of you in order to try to get to that tier 0. Because at the end of the day, these tiers are designed to be segregated, and you're not supposed to have that interaction. And so you're just grasping at the different pieces that may exist within an environment that would allow you to do that. Just a quick demo. So we created a user, or you can see that we do not have a user on that domain controller. And so what we do is we log into SEP, and then essentially we're creating a host integrity policy, and within that you can see this VB script push function. And so in here we can insert the script that we ultimately want to run. The first is going to be the creation of a user account. And so earlier we validated that that account didn't exist. We're going to try to add a regular domain user account. So once we create it, the second thing we're going to do is then at that point essentially try to use this and attempt to add this user account that we just created, this Red Team 1 user account that we just created, to the domain administrators group. And so usually, so here we are assigning that host integrity policy, and in this example it doesn't really matter, but we would be assigning it here to that domain administrator, or to that higher level tier that we're looking to move up into. And then here we're going to validate whether or not that user exists. And obviously you can see that it does exist and it now belongs to the domain administrators group. Okay. Typically we see SCCM in tier 0. It's very rare that you don't see it in tier 0. But that being said, some of the things we run across are within tier 0, while it may exist in tier 0, the network traffic that's allowed to interact with it isn't segregated and it isn't restricted to what we deem to be appropriate. And so while it's something that is rare and you probably won't be able to use it, another way similar to the SEP exploitation is to use SCCM in order to essentially push a payload to a specific target. And so what we do is we create a connection with SCCM and then create an application within it. And within this application, we would have that VB script. And then we would deploy that to the specific target that we were looking to target. In this case, you know, it may be tier 1, it may be tier 0. There's another way of doing it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with PowerShell Mafia's Power SCCM, but essentially these are the commands that could do the same thing. Create a connection to SCCM, create an application to be deployed, and then ultimately deploy that application specific to a tier that you're targeting. Okay. So at the end of this, what can you really do? I think our talk has been highlighting the fact that you really need to know who your administrators are and who those accounts are and those groups, because any sort of overlap in between them can be exploited to try to move up those tiers. One of the things that it's debated, but one of the things that we see is how network segmentation should really be applied to those different layers. In some cases, we see total network segmentation. I think it just needs to be effective for the environment that you're in. In a lot of cases, not a lot of traffic is allowed. There's definitely overlaps that we've seen where something's been applied and they're still allowing some sort of communication that allows us to push something up or interact with the tier that we really shouldn't. We've highlighted, I think, through the virtualization attacks or the endpoint attacks that you really need to be sure what's in your tier 0 and where things should reside. The problem with moving it into, you know, a more privileged tier is that your attack surface moves up in terms of what can be exploited in order to move across that tier. But the downside with not moving it in is essentially there are these access avenues that allow for rapid escalation, privilege escalation within the environment. This sounds silly, but even as we've seen some red forest environments, they haven't enrolled their multi-factor across all technologies that are being utilized. So we simply target the single factor authentication as a way in, and it's usually a pretty quick way. And then obviously if you're using multi-factor authentication, there's pretty explicit guidance on having at least one break the glass account that isn't using multi-factor authentication. But a lot of times there's credential reuse, or some of the accounts that were created before it was moved into a tiered model weren't ever rolled, and so you actually have to be worried about these legacy admin accounts and service accounts that haven't been rotated. So do you have anything else? Okay. I think that concludes our presentation. Do we have time for questions or? Okay.
Any questions? We got 5 minutes. Oh, there's one.
In the red forest environments you've seen, have you seen them start from a good position and then slowly degrade over time in their hygiene, or how do you see red forest start from a good position but then degrade to one where you can get in?
I think we all probably have our own opinion here. I would say in some situations, the red forest environment has been deployed as a result of something that's happened within the organization. So they're coming from, I've seen the term not red, I think they've used an orange, or they term it something else, but they're coming from, and this is probably everywhere, they're moving into a red forest rather than creating it from scratch. There's been a few places that have created it totally from scratch. But a lot of times, a lot of these tiers pre-exist and they're trying to push servers into the tier. And so I would say it's more defined as it moves up the tiers, but in terms of access. But from my perspective, I think some of these access avenues just haven't necessarily, or these attack paths just weren't part of the configuration. It was very Active Directory focused, and it didn't take into account some of these other variables that essentially undermined Active Directory. I don't know if you...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Time for maybe one more if you need so. All right. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, everyone.